right, SpongeBob. We're not cavemen. We have technology.
Hey, what's up? So, I'm a game developer, and I like to make games. More than I like to finish games though, I like to start new projects. At some point during the heat and fever of being upset that Horse Game 2 was stalling out midair and beginning to look like a serious catastrophe, I needed a break. And I took some time. I started to play Final Fantasy VII, the OG. I love this game. While I was playing, I applied my game dev eyes to it, and I tried to dissect every nook and cranny I could spot, thinking up ways that I would go about trying to build the same things for myself. That's just how game devs play. We look surgically for things we can learn from, and I started getting inspired. It gave me ideas on how I would reconstruct an old project the Cool Cats were working on a couple years back. So I blew off the dust and got cracking. A lot of wacky ideas I had started coming together really quickly. It was nice. Things were just clicking into place, and I've had a lot of momentum on this project, and it's starting to get to a point that I'm really proud of. It's nowhere even remotely close to being done. The scale of this game and its world is pretty big, but there's a lot here I wanted to talk about, and I thought it would be a great idea to start making some devlogs like I see so many developers I look up to doing. So in this first devlog, I'm going to talk a bit about the project and its origins, the fundamental concepts, and what I've been trying to do. And then I'm going to break down a lot of what's already been built and how it works. Following that, I'm going to try and keep making these to record and document the progress as the game comes together. And hopefully, who knows, maybe I'll get more people interested in giving feedback. So it was like 2022. Cool Cats were thinking about getting back together after, 2022. I guess it was only
2 years ago
this thing got started. It feels like a decade ago. Anyway, Cool Cats were riding high after doing a few game jams together, and a couple of us had just played the still not so stale Metroid Dread. We all were feeling the frenzy of wanting to take a crack at the Metroidvania genre, but of course sprinkle in our own flavors of different games we like. The idea we had was for a Metroidvania puzzle platformer, 2D movement set in a post-apocalyptic world and taking place in the ruins of a long since defunct factory in the middle of a wasteland. The goal of the game is to restore the factory and get it working again. And to do this, you would do a combination of fighting, exploring, unlocking, and building. There would be a sim element in the vein of Factorio where you would build and rearrange all these machines, pipes, and wires to manage resources and functionality across the still chaotic and dangerous factory, slowly breathing life back into it. The world, the lore, the story kept growing, as well as the influences and consequently the scope. However, this first attempt didn't make it off the ground.
Holy Jesus. What is that? What the fuck is that?
We tried developing some of the initial mechanics, but didn't get very far before life got hectic. We all got busy and pulled in different directions, and unfortunately the motivation just waned. But in 2023, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, I decided to take another crack at it, transforming into a slightly different vision, but still trying my best to keep a lot of the original soul alive. One of the first things I wanted to do was take a different approach than I had in the past to structuring a game and its notion of persistence. While playing Final Fantasy VII, I noticed how the game is basically just a series of rooms, or areas, that you walk through. You enter an area and there's a model there that represents a cloud. It really doesn't matter what stats you have, who's in your party, what materials equipped, or any of that. A room is always going to have a player model that represents what the player controls walking through it. Some background art to convey the part of the world you're in, and the entrances and exits that connect to different screens. When you're walking around, the area you're in has a certain set of enemies you might encounter on that specific screen, as well as a set of backgrounds that it might pick from when switching to combat in that area. It's only when you go into combat that your party and stats need to get loaded and be consistent. It's only when you open the inventory menu or interact with a shop that the game needs to load your equipment. And thus, it's pretty easy to think about how you would represent the state that the game is in for the purposes of saving and loading. Your party, stats, equipment, materia, inventory, settings, all just some variables and data that are easily writable to a file. Any specific thing might have some way of being represented in context like the inventory UI or during battle, but that doesn't need to get saved. Just what the thing is and who has it and when. How it gets represented at different moments, the game will handle at runtime. You can know what screen you're currently in, which exit you came in from. This might all seem extremely obvious and yeah, no duh, but for me, this is kind of revolutionary. I hadn't ever really broken down how to represent stuff in a game instead of actually constructing and maintaining things. So hopefully this would lend itself to some very streamlined development. Spoiler alert, it did. I had a really functional prototype testing this out in like one day. It helped that I had a lot of assets from the previous development sessions I could reuse. But the fact that the game could start out with a lot of this stuff already figured out was huge. So, Continuing in my time-honored tradition of stealing things I like from games that I enjoy, I also want to gush about the materia system from Final Fantasy VII. I've always thought this was such a cool way to do magic in classes. They really only barely teach you the basics of materia at the beginning, and there's so much that you, the player, are expected to just somehow figure out. So level 1, different equipment have different materia slots. You put a materia in a slot, and that character can use it. A lot of the time, this means just casting a spell by consuming MP, but some of them have other effects and conditions that get really wacky. Level 2 is when you notice this. The linked slots. Linking materia combines them, but it really only works with certain combinations. For example, all. If you link all with a materia, it will target all the targets on one side of the battle instead of an individual. And you could use this to make fire or bolt hit everyone. But you can also use it to make cure recover your whole team's health for no additional mana cost. Element applies the element of the materia to the equipment. So if you have element and fire on your weapon, your attacks now do that element of damage. But also if you put it defensively, you now absorb that element. And apparently enemies in the game have different strengths and weaknesses elementally, and there's like 100 fucking elements. And that sounds obvious, but I don't think the game anywhere really tells you about this. Level 3 is when you start digging deep and you say, all right, what the fuck is going on with materia? Not only do effect materia have elements such as fire, bolt, ice, etc., but so do summons. That means you can equip a summon along with an element to get some extra effects out of it. But applied effect is even cooler. As the name implies, it applies the effect of the materia instead of the element. The difference here being that element is used to calculate damage based on weaknesses and immunity. The effect is the effect. So if you get the transform materia and pair it with applied effect, your attacks will have a chance of inflicting mini or toad onto an enemy. This is insane. My punches can turn enemies into frogs now. Level 4 is enemy skill, and that's all I'm gonna say about that. Okay, sorry about that really long-winded tangent, but I really wanted to get into the fact that because of the way this system works, it lends itself to this really cool, in-depth, and most importantly, emergent customizability in the way you build characters and craft combat styles to suit a given situation. And I want to try to emulate that in Robot Game, but we need to put a pin in that. We'll come back around in a second. Next, I want to talk about one of my favorite games, Risk of Rain 2. This game rules, dog. This is what the fuck I'm talking about. At first, it's like, okay, cool. I play as these characters, they have these different abilities and playstyles. I pick up items that do neat things like make me attack faster or increase my movement speed, and I get items and level up to become more powerful. And as time keeps going, it gets harder and harder while I fight through these waves of enemies. Cool. But then you get to the real shit. You learn about bungus, you learn about combos, you learn about shield maxing and stacking items and proc chains and crit percentage, and you learn that if you push this game, and I mean really push it way past its limits, it will bring your computer to a fucking halt. If you can't analyze each frame individually like you're giving a PowerPoint presentation, it's not a real run. But mostly, I love the feeling of looking at the items, learning how they work, how they stack, and being able to plan my own way of synergizing these powers. I love the idea of stacking 400 soldier syringes and 10 crit glasses and just doing insane damage. I love the idea of stacking 100 topaz brooches and becoming unkillable.
What is this?
But most importantly, I love that Gesture of the Drowned reduces equipment cooldown. And if I have enough of these plus enough fuel cells and maybe a 57-leaf clover for good luck, I can get permanent uptime on Spinal Tonic, meaning I never get the debuff, so my stats are just crazy all the time. That's the kind of shit I want in my game. But now, circling back, what if we combined that system with materia?
Now I use polymerization to fuse them together.
Thus, power baubles. So here's the concept. In the factory, you can find modules. The Blastcaster is the primary weapon and tool that Arcadia uses in her adventure. It has a number of module slots. One's for lots of different things like on hit or on light attack or on grappling hook, etc. Think of these like hooks. Whenever you perform the described action, the module that you have equipped to that slot activates. But what is a module? It's just a thing that holds and activates power baubles. Modules can have up to a certain number of slots themselves within which you can attach power baubles. You'll be able to find modules with more slots and upgrade your modules later in the game as a form of progress. But the power baubles are the juice. They can be broken down into 3 basic types. Effect, which, as the name implies, has some effect when activated. An example might be Explode, which triggers an explosion when activated. Status, which usually just alters a stat either while it's equipped or when activated. For example, Fierce just increases your overall power and damage. And Condition, which will usually concern everything else that's not in the above 2 categories. Typically, these have a certain condition associated with activation or create some condition. Baubles also usually have a level and a cooldown cooldown time, meaning that they become more effective with increasing levels and might need some time to cool off before they can be activated again. Some combos I like are putting explode on various movement options such as on jump or on dash to add an extra layer of damage output and protection. Cooldown is a very overpowered bauble because it reduces the cooldown of all other baubles in the module to 0. The system mostly works, though I need a lot more baubles to flesh it out, and I think there are still some kinks in the UI that are getting in the way. This is also a fairly complex and unintuitive system, and one of the complaints I keep getting from testers is that when they open this menu, they just have no idea how any of this works. So I'll need to think of a really rock-solid way of introducing the players to the system and teaching them how to use it. One of the earliest systems after getting movement and rooms down pat was the save system. I talked in length during the introduction about some of the underlying principles I wanted to follow. I've also gone over these more in my Horse Game 2 postmortem, but a long time ago, I had an idea for a knockoff Resident Evil game. It was one of the earliest attempts at making a game I ever tried, even before Horse Game. It was pretty bad, and unfortunately I don't have a build of it or the project file, long gone. But this idea of finding like really old vintage computer terminals and saving your file to a floppy disk, I always found really charming. And it's something I've kind of pulled along with me throughout my time as a developer. And I thought, perfect, I can do the terminal thing. So I drew up a draft of the save terminal. Looks alright. I made this scene in Blender and I wanted to evoke that like Myst era early PC game FMV sequence look. So this is just a super low frame rate set of sprites rendered out from the Blender scene and then loaded into Godot. One of my favorite games of all time is the 2002 remake of Resident Evil for the GameCube. I love this game. Visually, it is absolutely breathtaking. It is a masterclass of aesthetic, art direction, atmosphere, vibe, everything I love. I've spent decades chasing the high this game gave me. But this is a polarizing game. A lot of people, even Resident Evil fans, hate this game for its outdated movement mechanics, its clunkiness, its slower pacing, and one of its most absolutely contentious systems, the limited saves as an item. To save in the game, you need to spend an inkwell at a typewriter. This is the origin of my use of the floppy disk at a computer terminal shtick. And at this point, this gave me a reason to work on several crucial systems at once: saving and loading, the saving UI, the inventory system, items, the inventory UI, transitioning between multiple UI and making it all work together. One of the things I've gotten a lot of praise on is the inventory screen. It's fairly unique, and I think I did a pretty good job. Original images I used came out of Night Cafe along with the base image sources for a lot of the game's assets. I sliced pieces off in Photoshop and animated the pieces unfolding like some kind of weird, indiscernible briefcase. The floppy disk I rendered in Blender for animating in the save screen. However, having to go to a save point while testing the game is a huge pain in the ass, so I also needed a way to just save the game on the fly. Thus, my plan is to use the different ways of saving as something to mark different difficulty levels. On easy, you can just save from the pause menu, and I might even add an autosave feature that can be toggled from the options menu. Normal has you forced to save at a save point, but they're always running and don't need an item to use. Hard would add memory disks and make them a requirement at save points, and the terminals themselves would need to be hooked up to a power source in order to work. But more on that later. Of course, being able to save and reload your game will only get you so far. If you run out of health, it's going to make it pretty difficult to keep making progress, and being stuck like that will quickly deter players from continuing. So we need to provide something that will allow the players to recover their health. Since we're already borrowing a lot of the combat staples from Dark Souls, such as light attack and heavy attack, as well as some of the button layouts, maybe we could borrow ideas like Estus flasks and recovery points. After brainstorming, I came up with the Nano Repair module, fitting for a robot. It's a little device that unleashes a swarm of nanites powered by the game's MacGuffin magic goop known as Substance X. It heals robots and repairs their damage, but at the start you only have a single use before it gets emptied, and it only heals a limited % of health. To refill it, you need to find, or eventually someday build, a repair station. A repair station needs energy and fuel, which in this case is the same substance that the healing modules use for, lore purposes, in order to run. It consumes a small amount of both to refill as many of your empty repairs as possible. All this is working pretty good. We've got some pretty decent designs for both of these things, and they weren't too difficult to put together. Initially. Some planned mechanics later on include repair kits, which will be a consumable item that heals a much smaller amount of health. They'll be a bit more common, but might help out in a pinch. These can be crafted using spare parts, which have a number of ways of being obtained. They can also be broken open to salvage for spare parts if you instead would rather have those than the healing. Spare parts in turn will have a lot of uses in crafting and construction. So early on in the project was this concept of factory simulation, building machines, connecting their power sources, distributing work, managing everything across the factory. And now we're finally getting around to implementing it. This was a bit tricky as I had to go a little bit deeper into my comp sci know-how to make this work. The recharging station is the first machine in this system, and it needs fuel and energy. So we have a couple different power sources as well as different types of power: energy, fluid, and pressure. To connect everything, we use something called a node graph. This is a data structure that keeps track of all the power nodes in the game, what rooms they're in, and how they're connected. It also has algorithms to optimize things like checking to see if there's a connection, finding the shortest path, detecting if there are any cycles, etc. It was kind of a pain in the ass to get this working, but with some spit, grit, and elbow grease, we klooched it together somehow. The last nail in the coffin was that it demanded a rewrite of the saving and loading system. Beforehand, I was using JSON to keep track of the data, which was okay because I could represent everything I needed with just strings and numbers, but now that the data was getting more complex, I was tracking more things, and some of those things were unique data types. I got to a point where JSON was just not feasible. Luckily, there's a thing called resource saver and resource loader. Basically, the refactor meant we had to move the parts of the game data code that has all the data into a script that gets attached to a resource. This is our game data now. The methods we use for interacting with it get moved into a script called Game Data Manager. Then all we have to do is just save our resource. It's pretty simple, but there's not a whole lot of solid examples showing how to do this for more complex situations. In order to set the mood, which is now spooky vibes, scary horror robot game in dark, terrifying Silent Hill, Resident Evil spooky caves and abandoned buildings, we need to get dark. Really dark. So dark that everyone asks me why the hell I have the brightness on my monitor turned up so high. And then we need a way to see in the dark. I like the game Signalis from 2022. That game is honestly amazing. Seriously, go play that game. It's a huge inspiration, and if you like legit survival horror, that game is a masterclass. But they made lighting a big part of that game's exploration. A lot of things require light for you to make progress, but light also alerts enemies and can put you in danger. I liked that. So I added a flashlight, and now you can find your way in the extremely dark areas. There's also a photoreceptive panel that can be used to charge batteries by using light from your flashlight. To achieve the dynamic darkness that works with the flashlight, we use a canvas modulate node in the rooms to set the mood. I extended this node to include some code that adjusts the brightness level after setting its intended darkness based on a brightness setting. This way, if something looked right on my screen but is totally unviewable for others, they can just turn their brightness up. The flashlight rig just sits on the player prefab. If you have the flashlight unlocked and it's turned on, then this node gets enabled. The light just rotates to point at the mouse cursor and moves up or down depending on how high up you're pointing it. The arms use a kind of poor man's IK to contort these sprites and stay attached and bow out depending on how far away you're shining the light. The drawback is that it's not attached at all to the player sprite, and I really don't know of a way that I could realistically achieve that. So there are times where it can look desynced. We've got a lot of enemies in the game so far, and I love them a lot. Some cute and adorable and friend-shaped, others scary and horrifying, and featuring amazing voice work from my friends. I hope to also hide a lot of lore about these enemies that the player can find and discover to further immerse themselves in the world. We've also got the first boss, which is the TM1200 Trash Master from Valix Corp. He hurls gigantic trash boulders at you, but he's really a big softie. I've never done a boss fight in a game before, so this is my first attempt. I hope people are nice to him. A big part of the pipeline for the player as well as NPCs is to design a sketch, then model it in Blender, rig it, animate it, then export that as a sprite sheet. I use this free plugin made by someone really cool to do this. We get the sprite sheet into Godot, sometimes after a little bit of touch up in the shop, and get an animated sprite 2D node filled out. Then we use the state machine to control what happens and how it all works and hook up the states to the animations. Alright, well, I covered a lot. There's a whole lot more going on that I haven't talked about yet, but we might get to that stuff in another video. As I said before, I'm going to keep working on this game and try to archive the process in these devlogs, but I don't know when the next one will be. Hopefully like once a month or every 2 months or every 2 weeks if I'm being optimistic. I really don't know. At the time of writing this, I don't even know when I'm gonna get around to making this first one, which feels weird, like I'm in some kind of preemptive time loop of referring to my own upcoming editing process, thinking about editing myself, talking about writing the part where I talk about whatever. Thanks for watching, and if you want to play the demo of this weird little game or any of my other projects, check out my itch.io page, and maybe support me on Patreon. If you want to stay up to date with progress as I report on it, hit subscribe, I guess. I don't think that even really works anymore, so if the algorithm thinks that you might watch a video, then it'll probably get to you. If you liked the vid, hit the like button and leave a comment if you have any thoughts or feedback about the game. And yeah, I hope to see you next time. That's all I got. Peace.